The Unifying Science of the Human System, a first principles synthesis of psychological literature. This extensive bibliography, ranging from the DSM-5 classification to neurocognitive intelligence, function, to evolutionary psychology, origin, can be synthesized into 3 non-negotiable first principles that define the human condition. These principles transcend individual subfields, whether clinical, developmental, or behavioral, and form the irreducible bedrock of the science of the mind. First principle, the organism as a single, integrated, evolving system, the central. Truth unifying this collection is the recognition that the human being is not a collection of isolated mental traits, but a continuously evolving, integrated system where behavior, cognition, and emotion are inseparably linked to underlying biology and developmental history. This principle is explicitly affirmed by titles like Body, Brain, Behavior, the Neuroscience of Feelings, and the foundational text on Principles of Behavior. A. The irreducibility of development and biology. Every component of the human system is a product of continuous dynamic development starting in utero. Development is structural, 0 to birth, the developing mind. The brain is built, not simply loaded. Texts like 0 to Birth, How the Human Brain is Built and the Developing Mind by Siegel emphasize that psychological outcomes, from emotional regulation to attachment, are rooted in the anatomical and functional organization of neural pathways during critical periods. Early experiences, particularly in childhood, as highlighted by the Developmental Psychology of the Black Child by Amos Wilson and Theories of Human Development, fundamentally construct the self. A deficit at the synaptic level becomes a deficit in behavior. Therefore, psychological problems are often, at their core, developmental failures of integration. The mind-brain alchemy, neuroscience of feelings, body-brain behavior. The strict mind-body dualism is rejected. The neuroscience of feelings and general cognitive neuroscience texts affirm that feelings, decisions, and even consciousness are emergent properties of the physical brain. Emotions are not ethereal concepts, but tangible results of neurochemical signals, dopamine, cortisol, and network activity. The physical health, stress, as explored in the Wiley Encyclopedia of Health Psychology, is inextricably linked to mental state. The foundational truth is, to understand the self, one must understand the circuit. All psychological phenomena are expressions of biological structure in action. Behavior as adaptation, evolutionary psychology. The system is fundamentally adaptive. Evolutionary psychology by Buss and other texts on prosocial and lying behavior assert that the mind's cognitive architecture, e.g., our capacity for deception, cooperation, or motivation, evolved to solve ancestral survival and reproductive problems. The principle is that current behavior is a compromised solution to a past problem. Our motivational framework, motivational psychology of human development, is rooted in the survival mechanisms that drove our ancestors. B. The principle of systemic flaw, the DSM-TR and big behaviors. Even when functioning outside the norm, the system remains a structured, understandable entity. Classification reflects systemic breakdown, DSM-5 to TR. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5 TR, does not describe random dysfunctions. It classifies predictable, patterned breakdowns in the integrated system. Failures of emotional regulation, cognitive integration, or behavioral control. It outlines the common ways the structure fails under internal, genetic, or external trauma. Load behavior is code, the Behavior Operations Manual. Behavior itself is the output of the integrated neurocognitive system. The Behavior Operations Manual and texts on applied behavior analysis view actions as outputs that are observable, measurable, and modifiable through the precise manipulation of environmental inputs, consequences, and antecedents. The principle, behavior, even big behaviors in small containers, children, is a form of neurocognitive intelligence that can be decoded and reprogrammed. Second principle, the self is defined by contextual transactions. The second principle establishes that the psychological system's performance, stability, and trajectory are fundamentally determined by its dynamic transactions with the external environment, particularly authority, relationships, and culture. A. The law of relational shaping. The self is developed and defined by the social container it inhabits. Development as negotiation, the evolving self. Robert Kegan's work, The Evolving Self, posits that human development is a lifelong process of negotiating the balance between autonomy and inclusion, the self's need for independence versus the need to belong. Maturity is defined by increasing the complexity of this negotiation. This mirrors the relational nature of all learning and growth. The authority gradient, obedience to authority, the psychology of influence. The environment provides necessary structure via authority, but this structure is a profound source of ethical and behavioral risk. Milgram's work shows that an authority gradient can switch the self from an autonomous state to an agentic state, overriding moral cognition. Cialdini's psychology of influence reveals that authority is one of several universal triggers, like social proof or reciprocity, that exploit our need for social compliance to achieve transactional goals. The truth is, the self's ethical boundaries are conditional and highly permeable to perceived social legitimacy. Culture as cognitive map, developmental psychology of the black child. The social environment is not neutral. Amos Wilson's work emphasizes that culture shapes the very standards, motivations, and coping mechanisms of development. The context, social, racial, and historical, dictates the problems the developing self must solve, meaning that psychological development is always culturally embedded and differentially challenging. B. The transactional nature of pathology. And healing psychological distress is understood not as an internal failure, but as a relational and contextual mismatch. The need for relational repair, the gift of therapy, trauma. The healing process, the gift of therapy, is fundamentally relational, focusing on the quality of the therapeutic relationship as the primary agent of change. Likewise, trauma, the body keeps the score, often stems from a relational breach, necessitating relational repair. The core principle, wounds sustained in a relationship must be healed in a relationship. The cognitive mismatch, theory of mind, emotional and behavioral disorders. Difficulties in social function, such as those seen in autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and emotional and behavioral disorders, often stem from a breakdown in theory of mind, the cognitive ability to attribute mental states to oneself and others. The transactional failure to understand others' perspectives leads to predictable behavioral outputs. This confirms that social competence is a cognitive skill set that is vulnerable to developmental disruption. Third principle, adaptation requires conscious systemic reorganization. The final irreducible principle, drawn from the texts on therapy, learning, and self-change, is that moving the human system from a state of dysfunction to one of flourishing, whether in health, development, or performance, requires an active, conscious, and continuous process of systemic reorganization. Simple desire is insufficient. The structure must change. A. Neuroplasticity as the mechanism of change. The brain is reprogrammable. The brain that changes itself, cognitive neuroscience. Dowage's work on neuroplasticity is the biological key to all therapeutic and learning efforts. The brain, through sustained directed effort, can physically rewire itself to overcome dysfunction, e.g., remapping sensory areas. This validates the effort required by positive psychology, human strengths, and applied learning. The principle change is not an epiphany. It is the sustained repetition necessary to physically solidify a new neural pathway. The behavioral loop, applied behavior analysis, principles of behavior. Behavioral change requires consciously changing the stimulus-response-consequence loop. The Handbook of Applied Behavior Analysis provides the methodologies for systematically deconstructing and rebuilding behavior patterns based on operant and classical conditioning. The principle, the environment dictates the behavior. Changing the environment, inputs and consequences, is the only reliable path to changing the behavior, output. B. The systemic mandate for resilience hacking, cognitive flaws, cognitive neuroscience, lying. Conscious change begins with metacognition, knowing the system's flaws. Kahneman's work and the studies on the psychology of lying and misrepresentations arm the self with knowledge about its own biases and vulnerabilities to deception. The principle: System 2 must be trained to recognize and override System 1's automated errors and the influence tactics that exploit them. Motivation for mastery, motivational psychology, the evolving self. Sustained development is driven by a hierarchy of motivation that moves beyond simple survival toward mastery and complexity. Robert Kegan's framework suggests that true growth is moving toward increasingly complex ways of knowing the world. The ultimate principle of human flourishing, synthesizing all texts, is: the goal of the human system is not static contentment, but continuous, deliberate structural growth, reorganization, toward higher states of integration and resilience.